Fear has a distinct smell. In the Danjuma house, it smelled like lemon polish, expensive leather, and cold copper. Alhaji Musa Danjuma, the man who built the family from nothing, hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. His men tiptoed around his wheelchair like it was a landmine. His own son treated him like a loaded gun that might still have 1 round left in the chamber. And his 8-year-old grandson, a boy named Sani, had never once heard his grandfather say his name. But Halima Bello wasn't one of them. She wasn't blood, she wasn't muscle, and she wasn't afraid. She was a critical care paramedic, making $28 an hour, running on cold coffee and 3 hours of sleep, and she was bone deep out of patience. So she said the word. But to understand how 1 word from a stranger cracked open a house full of dangerous, silent men, you have to know how she got through the door in the first place. 6 weeks earlier, a 911 call came in from a mansion on the Rhode Island coast that most people only ever saw from the water. Cardiac arrest, elderly male, unresponsive. The rig that answered was a private critical care unit, and the medic riding lead was Halima Bello, 32, a former combat medic with the calm of someone who's watched too many people leave the world the same undignified way, no matter their money. When the ambulance rolled through those iron gates, 6 men in tailored suits stood in the rain, every one with a hand inside his jacket. Halima didn't slow down. She walked into a room where a terrifying old man lay gray and lifeless, a man no one had dared put their hands on in years. She did. She tore his shirt open, laced her fingers over his sternum, and started compressions on the most feared man on that coast. A guard reached for her shoulder. Without looking up, she said, "Touch me again, and he dies while you waste my time." 90 seconds later, under her hands, Musa Danjuma's heart stuttered back into rhythm. That's the day the family stopped seeing her as a first responder and started seeing her as something they couldn't afford to lose. That's where our story really begins. Before we go any further, this channel is brand new, and every single subscribe is what keeps stories like this one alive. It's free. It takes 1 second, and it means more than you'll ever know. Hit that subscribe button, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and let's step into this house together. Black Roots Untold. So they hired her, not as an EMS crew rolling in and out, but as a private contract medic, on the estate every morning, keeping the old man stable until the family transition was finalized. Halima had learned not to ask rich, dangerous people what their private phrases meant. The gates didn't open for her that first morning. They retreated. She idled her rusted 2012 Honda in the driveway, the engine ticking in the July heat, and looked at 2 men flanking the entrance who looked less like security and more like walking brick walls poured into wool. They didn't smile. They didn't ask for ID. They just stared, cataloging every dent on her fender, every fray on her navy uniform. She crept up the winding path. Halima Bello was underslept, underpaid, and unimpressed by wealth. For a decade she'd watched rich men and poor men die exactly the same way. Death was the great equalizer, and it usually involved soiled sheets and a loss of dignity. These mansions held no magic for her, just oversized hospices with better landscaping. The front door opened before she reached the steps, but it wasn't a man in a suit standing there. It was a boy, small for 8, in a crisp button-down someone had ironed for him, holding a crayon drawing of a stick-figure family. He looked up at her with enormous, careful eyes. Not scared, exactly. Watchful. The way kids get when they've learned the adults around them are made of glass and gunpowder. Nobody spoke to him. That was the thing Halima noticed first. 2 guards stood behind him, and neither glanced down. The boy lived inside the same silence his grandfather did. A small, quiet ghost, in a house where the loudest thing was fear. "Hi," Halima said to him. The boy blinked, like he wasn't used to being addressed. Then, a low baritone cut through the hall. "Sani, upstairs." Idris Danjuma stepped into the doorway, the kind of handsome that felt dangerous, a sharp edge hidden under silk. Dark hair, impeccably cut, deep purple bruises under his eyes, that betrayed a man who hadn't truly slept in a very long time. A charcoal suit, over a frame built for violence, and Halima clocked the bulge under his left arm. "A holster, Miss Bello," he said, following her eyes. Sani gave Halima one last look and vanished up the staircase without a word. "Mr. Danjuma," she replied, shifting her jump bag onto her shoulder. "I'm here for the morning shift." Idris didn't move. He studied her, looking for the tremor in the hands every other caregiver had carried into this house. Halima just looked back, flat and even. "The agency said, you were the one who didn't flinch," he finally said, stepping aside. "The agency says, whatever keeps the contract signed," Halima answered, walking into a foyer that smelled of old money and beeswax. "But I don't quit. I've worked combative dementia, end-stage liver failure, roadside traumas that'd turn your men's stomachs. Your father's an 80-year-old with a failing heart. We'll manage." Idris's jaw tightened. "My father is Alhaji Musa Danjuma. I read the chart. The chart doesn't tell you who he is." He fell into step beside her. 3 people have walked out in 2 weeks. He doesn't hit them. He doesn't throw things. He just looks at them. He intimidates them into quitting. He reminds them they're mortal. Idris corrected, softly. They reached heavy oak doors at the end of the western wing. 2 more guards stood outside. One, younger, with a jagged scar through his eyebrow, looked at Halima with open pity. "He hasn't spoken since the second stroke," Idris said, hand on the brass knob. 3 years. "The doctors say the vocal cords are fine. The mind's mostly there. He just chooses silence, refuses his medication, won't eat unless forced. I need him comfortable, but alive, until the transition is finished. Do you understand? I understand my job. I keep him stable. I keep him medicated, and I preserve whatever dignity he has left." For a second, the polished boss slipped, and she saw a desperate, exhausted son. "Just don't let him break you," he said, and pushed the doors open. The room was vast, suffocatingly dark and freezing. Velvet curtains blotted out the July sun. In a mechanized wheelchair by the window sat Alhaji Musa Danjuma, a frail shadow, swallowed by a cashmere blanket, skin the color of old mahogany, stretched tight over sharp, predatory bone. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold, pitch black, unblinking. The eyes of a man who'd ordered dozens of deaths, built an empire on blood and fear, and felt zero remorse. His head turned slowly, the gaze locked onto her like a physical weight. The scarred guard cleared his throat. Halima set her bag on the dresser. The thud echoed like a gunshot. "Good morning, Mr. Danjuma," she said, steady. "I'm Halima. I'm going to open those curtains. It smells like a crypt in here." She didn't wait for permission. She crossed the room, grabbed the drapes, and yanked them apart. Sunlight flooded in, harsh and unforgiving. Musa hissed, a dry, rattling sound, and squeezed his eyes shut. Behind her, Idris exhaled a breath he'd been holding for years. By the end of that first week, she understood why the others had run. Musa Danjuma didn't need to throw a punch to wage war. He refused to open his mouth for the medication. He'd stare at one spot on the wall for hours, until the silence rang in her ears. When she changed his linens, he didn't look at her face. He looked at her wrists, her throat, the fragile points. "You're agitating him," the scarred guard, Leo, muttered on the 4th day, as she tried and failed to get a blood pressure. The old man had his arm clamped to his side, jaw like granite. "Nobody forces the Alhaji," Leo warned, stepping forward. Halima turned on her heel. "Listen carefully. I don't care if he's the Alhaji, the Pope, or the President. Right now, he's an 80-year-old in congestive heart failure. If I can't read his pressure, I can't tell if the beta blockers are crashing his system. And then he codes on my shift. I am not losing my license over one stubborn old man's ego." Leo blinked, thrown by the venom out of a 5'4" woman in a paramedic uniform. A slow clap broke the tension. Idris in the doorway, sleeves rolled to reveal dark ink on his forearms. "You heard the medic, Leo. Step back." Leo retreated. Idris crouched by his father's chair, the ruthlessness gone. "Papa, let her do her job." Musa looked at his son. For a fraction of a second, something softened in that terrible gaze, before the iron curtain slammed back down. He turned to the window and kept his arm pinned. "Give him an hour," Idris told her. "He's dehydrating," she said quietly. "If he doesn't take fluids by 3, I'm putting a line in, and he'll fight it." "Then do it. Whatever it takes. Keep him alive." He swept out, and Halima stood there, looking at the silent old king by the window, not knowing that the person who'd finally teach her how to break the siege wasn't the son or the father. It was the boy on the staircase. He came to her that afternoon. Halima was in the kitchenette off the suite, filling a glass with water, when she felt the presence in the doorway. She turned, half expecting Leo. It was Sani, in his ironed shirt, a cracked tablet held against his chest, the way he'd held the drawing. He glanced back at the empty hall, then stepped inside like he was crossing a border. "You're the one who yelled at Leo." "I was, yeah. Nobody yells in this house." "I noticed." Sani looked at the closed doors to his grandfather's room. When he spoke again, his voice dropped so low she had to lean down, and what he said knocked the breath clean out of her, harder than any of the old man's black-eyed threats. "Can you make my grandfather say my name?" Halima went very still. "He's never said it," the boy went on. Fast now, like he'd held it in for years. "Not once. My dad says he stopped talking because his heart got hurt. But I think if he could just say it one time, then I'd know he knew who I was. That's all. Just my name. Just Sani." For 10 years, Halima had built a wall between herself and every patient. Detachment was survival. And this little boy, in one sentence, reached over that wall and pulled a brick clean out. "I can't promise you that," she said, because she never lied to kids. "But here's what I can promise. I'll talk to him like he's a person, every single day, whether he likes it or not. Deal?" Sani nodded, solemn as a judge, and slipped back into the silent house. And Halima, who'd walked in thinking of nothing but her rent, walked back to the old man's room, carrying a mission she hadn't asked for. She set the glass on his tray, pulled up a stool, and sat directly in his line of sight. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly, talking to him like an equal. "You think you're taking back control. Your body's failing. Your empire's in your son's hands, and the only thing left that you can command is what goes into your mouth." His eyes snapped to hers, furious. She leaned closer. "It's a pathetic strategy. You're not dying a martyr. You're dying a stubborn, dehydrated old man, in a house with a little boy in it, who watches every second." Musa's breath hitched. His skeletal hand swept across the tray. The glass launched and shattered against her chest, ice water soaking through her uniform, shards exploding on the floor. "Hey!" Leo surged forward. Halima raised a hand, water dripping from her chin. "Stop!" Leo froze. She didn't wipe her face. She didn't flinch. She stared at the old man, chest heaving, looking triumphant for the first time in 3 years. He'd finally gotten a reaction. She looked down at her soaked uniform, then back up. Fine, she said, dead flat. We'll do it the hard way. She drove home through a summer storm, showered, and sat on her ugly couch in the dark, and did something she hadn't done in a long time. She let herself remember where she came from. Halima Bello had a name her mother whispered over her like a prayer. Her mother, who came from Kano, who cooked with her hands and scolded in a language that sounded like rushing water and warm stone. Halima had spent her 20s sanding that language off. On the job she went by Hallie. Easier, in an ambulance, in America, to be smooth and flat and from nowhere in particular. She hadn't spoken a full sentence of Hausa since the day they lowered her mother into the ground. And now there was an old man refusing to speak at all, and a little boy who just wanted to hear his own name, and something in her chest she'd buried a long time ago was starting, quietly, to ache. She picked up her phone to call the agency. Hostile environment, combative patient, request reassignment, the smart thing. Then she thought about Sani's face. Just my name, just Sani. She put the phone down. She'd go back. If this story's got its hooks in you, do us one small thing. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell us down in the comments, what do you think the very first word out of Alhaji Musa's mouth is going to be? More stories every week on Black Roots Untold. The next afternoon the storm grew teeth, rained sideways off the Atlantic, the sky the color of a bruise. Inside Musa's room it was just the three of them. Halima, the old man, and Idris in the far corner. He'd dismissed the guards, knowing they'd only escalate him. She had the IV line prepared. "Mr. Danjuma, this is going to pinch," she said, calm, swabbing the thin, bruised skin of his forearm. Musa was shaking. Not with fear, with rage. He hated the vulnerability, hated the needle, and most of all hated her, because she never looked away. As she uncapped the needle, his good hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. For an 80-year-old with a failing heart, the grip was terrifying, bony fingers digging in like steel. "Let go of her, Papa," Idris said, stepping forward. Musa ignored him, black eyes boring into her face, twisting her wrist, trying to make her cry out. The pain spiked up her arm. Every instinct screamed to pull back. She shoved it down. She didn't pull away. That's what he expected. Instead, she leaned into him, close enough to smell the age and anger on his breath. Idris was suddenly there, gripping his father's shoulder. "Let her go. Now." Halima raised her free hand and signaled him to stop, never taking her eyes off Musa. And this time, she didn't see the monster everyone else saw. She saw the tremor in his jaw, the drowning panic of a man locked inside a failing body, the arthritis flaring white-hot in his knuckles as he clung to her. He was fighting a war he'd already lost, against an enemy, time. He couldn't shoot, and underneath all of it, how unbearably tired he was. And then, out of the buried place in her chest, the old language rose up on its own. She stopped fighting his grip and went completely limp, dead weight in his hand. Musa blinked, confused by the lack of resistance. She looked into his eyes, her voice dropping under the thunder, soft and certain. "Hakuri. Patience. Peace. I see your pain. You don't have to fight anymore." The word hung there, the language of his childhood, of his mother's compound half a world away, spoken not with fear, but with quiet, absolute tenderness, by a woman who owned nothing but a rusted Honda and a jump bag. Musa froze. She laid her free hand over his trembling grip. "Hakuri, Alhaji," she whispered. "The war is over. Let it go." For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly, his fingers uncurled. The steel clamp became frail, trembling bone. The fire in his eyes flickered, dimmed, gave way to exhaustion. He turned his face to the rain-streaked window, shoulders slumping. The terrifying old king deflated, and what was left was just a tired old man. Halima quickly slid the needle in, taped it, connected the line. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look. Idris stared, like she'd performed a miracle. He hasn't yielded to anyone in 40 years. Everyone gets tired, Mr. Danjuma, she said, packing up, her hands finally shaking now. The adrenaline was draining. Even monsters. And then, from the chair by the window, a sound cut through the room. Raspy, broken, like two stones grinding. A voice that hadn't been used in over 1,000 days. But it didn't say not a monster. It didn't say survivor. It said one word, a name, Sani. Idris physically recoiled, the color draining from his face. And in the doorway, where none of them had noticed him, a small boy, with a cracked tablet, held up in both shaking hands, made a tiny, choked sound. A red light blinked on the screen. He'd been recording. He'd crept down the hall to watch the strange medic. And instead, he'd caught the one thing he'd asked for, his grandfather, after 3 years of silence, saying his name. Sani lowered the tablet, tears running freely. He said it, the boy whispered. He said my name. Musa's black eyes found the boy. Something moved across that hard old face that hadn't been there in years. He didn't say it again, but he lifted his good hand, the one that had just been crushing Halima's wrist, and held it out, palm up, toward his grandson. Sani ran across the room and took it. Halima zipped her bag and slipped into the hall so the two of them could have the moment that belonged to them. She leaned against the cool plaster and let out a long breath. Her wrist throbbed. She rolled up her sleeve, 4 dark fingerprints already blooming. Miss Bello, the gravel voice came from behind her. Idris had followed her out and pulled the doors shut, leaving father and son inside. How did you do that? I didn't do anything, she said, starting toward the foyer. He fell into step. The best neurologists in Boston said the block was permanent. You say one word and he talks. He says my son's name, a boy he's never once. His voice caught. How? I treated him like a person, and I said a word my grandmother used to say. It isn't magic. I said hakuri. It means patience. Most common word there is. She stopped and looked up at him. The reason it worked isn't the language, Mr. Danjuma. For 3 years, everyone in this house has talked at him, or been too scared to talk to him at all. Nobody sat down and told him it was okay to stop fighting. Not you, not your men. She paused. Not even that little boy. Until he found someone brave enough to ask on his behalf. Idris was quiet a long moment. Rain hammered the windows. You didn't just get an old man to take an IV, he finally said. You gave my son the one thing I never could. She didn't answer. She grabbed her jump bag, pushed open the front door, and walked out into the storm. Not knowing that the video on a little boy's cracked tablet, a recording made out of nothing but love, was about to become the most important weapon in a war that hadn't even started yet. Word travels fast, in a house built on secrets. By the next morning, everyone knew. The medic had made the Alhaji speak, made him say the boy's name. The men who'd spent 3 years walking on eggshells around that silent wheelchair now watched Halima pass with reverence and confusion. And the story didn't stay inside those walls. That week, an old imam came to the estate, a friend of Musa's from the early days, one of the few men the Alhaji had ever respected. He'd heard the whisper travel through the diaspora 2 states over, that the great Musa Danjuma, whom the best doctors had given up on, had been called back to the living by a young woman speaking the language of home. When he left, he stopped Halima in the foyer, took both her hands, and said something she carried the rest of her life. They spent millions to buy his health, doctors, machines, specialists. And you gave him back his tongue, with one word from his own mother's mouth. Money forgot who he was, daughter. You remembered. That story spread. But the wrong people heard it too. Because a speaking Al-Haji changes everything. For 3 years, a rival syndicate out of New York, the Okoro family, had been circling. They'd heard the rumors that Musa was as good as dead, that Idris was propping up a corpse to hold the alliances together. A dead, silent king is an invitation to a bloodbath. But a breathing, speaking Al-Haji is a wall you think twice about hitting. Trouble was, the Okoros didn't believe a rumor, and the fastest way to get proof was to come see the body for themselves. The storm that had circled all week broke into a full nor'easter the night they came. Halima had been kept on the estate under an exclusive contract by then. The moment her face got tied to the Danjuma name, Idris told her, she became a target, and the only place he could keep her safe was inside the walls. She'd fought it, and made exactly one condition: in the kitchen at 2 a.m, across the marble island from a man carrying a collapsing bridge on his shoulders. That boy. Whatever this war is, whatever your men do, Sani never becomes a piece on the board. You don't use him. He is not leverage. He's a kid. Idris had looked at her a long moment. Done. And he'd meant it. She thought about that promise, the night the lights went out. It happened all at once. The power hummed, flickered, and died, and the whole estate dropped into darkness. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the silence was instant and total. Generator should kick in, Leo hissed. 10 seconds. Nothing. Then, from deep in the house, a heavy thud, not thunder, a door coming off its hinges. Halima was in Musa's room, and so was Sani. The boy had taken to sitting with his grandfather in the evenings, playing the video of his own name, over and over. Now he was frozen in the dark, and Halima moved on pure instinct, found him by sound, pulled him down behind the heavy bed frame, put her body between him and the door. Stay low, stay quiet. I've got you. Leo's flashlight clicked on, catching the pistol in his fist. Musa was awake, impossibly calm. His rusted voice came low and clear. They sent water. Idris is a hammer. He'll swing at the front door. But water finds the cracks. They'll come up the back stairs. Tell my son. Footsteps pounded the hall. Someone yanked the double doors. Locked. A voice she didn't know shouted, "Blow it." "Down, down," Halima whispered, curling over the boy, her arms around his head, the way she'd been trained a lifetime ago, in a very different war. The blast tore the doors inward, in splinters and smoke. 3 men in tactical gear moved through the haze with terrifying precision, rifle lights slicing the smoke. "Target in the bed," one said, and raised his weapon at the old man. 2 things happened at once. Halima, who couldn't reach the grandfather in time, made herself bigger over Sani, daring anyone to reach him. And Idris came through the smoke, like something out of a nightmare. He didn't shout. He'd been coming up the front the moment the lights died, his gut telling him what his father's mind already knew. He came in behind the gunman with a suppressed pistol and executed. 2 soft coughs, and the man on the left dropped. The lead gunman spun. Idris forced the barrel to the ceiling as it stitched plaster across the room, drove a knee into his chest, put him down. The third swung toward Idris, and a single shot cracked from the floor. Leo, bleeding from a gash over his eye, had recovered his weapon. The firefight lasted less than 5 seconds. Silence slammed back down, broken only by the rain, the ringing in Halima's ears, and Sani's fast, terrified breathing against her chest. "Halima," Idris's voice, tight. He stood at the foot of the bed, suit gray with plaster, and dark with worse, eyes wild. "Are you hit? Is he?" She ran her hands over Sani, head, arms, back, and felt nothing but a scared, whole, living child. "He's okay," she said. Her voice sounded like someone else's. "We're okay." Idris exhaled like the floor had caught him. From the bed came a slow, dry chuckle. Musa, alive, untouched. He looked at the bodies, then up at his son, black eyes burning with dark triumph. They forgot. The house is built on rock. Then his gaze shifted, to Halima, to the boy buried against her, and the triumph faded into something she'd never seen on that face. "And the medic," he added softly, "is crazy." Halima didn't scream. Years of trauma rotations had wired her to lock panic in a box and work. Leo was bleeding badly from his scalp. She pressed gauze hard against it. Triage in a slaughterhouse, the only thing that kept her hands from shaking. The cleanup crew came fast and quiet, moving bodies like a spill on aisle 4. As they wheeled Musa out past her, the old man raised his good hand and the chair stopped. He didn't say thank you. Men like Musa Danjuma didn't thank people. He tapped the back of her bruised knuckles with one cold finger. Twice. A silent anointing. Then he dropped his hand. "Go," he told the guards. Later, in the quiet, Idris found her in the vault kitchen with Sani asleep against her side, and he did the math everyone had missed in the noise. They came for proof the old man was dead, the only thing worth those bodies. Their body cams streamed back to their handlers. They saw him, alive, giving orders in the dark. "So they got their proof," Halima said. "The wrong kind, the worst kind. But that's not what ends this. This is." He picked up the cracked tablet that had slid from Sani's pocket in the chaos and pressed play. A raspy old voice in a dark room said a little boy's name, Sani, "My father," speaking, blessing his line. Not a corpse being propped up. "I can get this in front of every family from Brooklyn to the Bronx by tomorrow. They hit us to prove he was gone." Instead, a video an 8-year-old made, because he wanted to hear his own name, tells the whole world the king is still on his throne. Halima looked down at the sleeping boy. "So he saved you." Not the video, him. He just wanted his grandfather to know who he was. And that's the thing that keeps this family standing. Idris looked at his son a long moment, and something in his hard face came all the way undone. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Weeks later, the estate had become a fortress, and the fortress had become something almost like a home. The Okoro War cooled the way Idris promised. You don't march on a house whose king the whole world just watched speak. Musa moved back upstairs, into a room with the curtains open now, because Halima had opened them the first day, and he'd never once asked her to close them again. He took his medication without fighting. He ate. His voice came back a little more each day, rusty and slow, mostly saved for one small audience. Every evening, Sani sat on the edge of his grandfather's bed, and every evening, Halima did the thing she'd sworn she'd never do again. She reached into the buried place, pulled out the language her mother sang over her, and taught it to a hard old man relearning how to be gentle, and to a little boy who'd waited his whole life to be seen. A lullaby from Kano, that Musa hadn't heard since before he crossed an ocean and built an empire out of blood. The old man's cracked voice, the boy's clear one, and Halima's in between. 3 generations of a language that almost died, coming back one soft word at a time. Idris stood in the doorway one of those nights and just watched. When she came out, he didn't reach for her wrist the way his father had. He reached, gently, for her hand. A man who dealt in death, holding the hand of a woman who dealt in keeping people alive. "You gave my son a grandfather. You gave my father his voice. You gave this house something I couldn't buy, with everything I own." He paused. "What do I give you?" "You already paid the rent," Halima said, the corner of her mouth lifting. But her heart was hammering, and they both knew the war outside wasn't the only dangerous thing sparking in that house. She looked back down the hall, to the old king and the little boy leaning into each other in the lamplight, saying the words back and forth like a secret. A survivor teaching a survivor how to be a family. She'd walked into that house for $28 an hour. She was leaving it. One day, when it was safe, if it was ever safe, with something she'd spent 10 years telling herself she didn't need. And that's where we leave them. A silent king who found his voice. A boy who finally heard his own name. A medic who buried where she came from and dug it back up to save a stranger. And a war that's only paused, not over. With a dangerous, quiet something between Halima and Idris that could hold this family together or burn the whole empire to the ground. Will the Okoros come back for the boy who became the proof? Will Halima ever walk out those gates, and would she still want to? And that little cracked tablet, with a grandfather's voice on it, how many times do you think Sani has played it back by now? If you're still here with us, then you're part of this story now. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest, the word in Hausa, the boy's video, or the 2 taps on the back of her hand. Black Roots Untold.